Welcome to part 3 of the final extra lecture for Justice and Society. So now we're going to talk about Sandel's case studies. For the issues that he thinks morality cannot be taken out of the debate, no matter how hard we try. Now this is a logical point. Whatever you rely on still has an implicit moral argument in it. And these cases are abortion and stem cell research. So these are social issues that aren't going away, and he thinks that we can't decide on them without relying on moral argumentation and belief systems. So advocates of individual freedom claim that they're not relying on values, that it's up to each individual woman to decide. So their argument is right on the top. That's explicitly about individual liberty. I can't tell you what's morally wrong and what's morally right as a classical liberal. So how, if this is their argument, does Sandel think that they're still morally arguing? So at the end of the day, they rely on arguments that the fetus is not yet a person. So this implies that personhood is something to be protected by the law. And if a fetus is not a person, then abortion is okay. So there's a value being argued in there, that the value of human life is intrinsically important. That says the way life ought to be. We ought to make policies to protect human life, but we don't need to worry about things that aren't human life. So the same goes for stem cell research. Those who advocate for it discuss many, many possible benefits for humanity. But there's still a hidden premise, an implicit premise that they rely on. And again, that's that embryonic material doesn't count as a person, so it doesn't need to be protected like a person is. There is a counter to this from the classical liberal camp. So thinkers like Kant or Rawls will readily admit that we should value individual human life and that the definition of life is important to figure out. So with abortion, you wonder when it starts. Conservatives will say it starts at conception, and liberals will say no, it's not until later. So classical liberals instead say it's not the same as every other kind of value. Life itself versus how life should be lived. Everybody has to agree with the baseline that human life matters, because that's the basis of all morality. We need to respect other persons. It's not the same as taking policy and imposing your values on somebody else. So if life or existence is the baseline, you can protect that while not saying that life needs to be a certain way to be morally good. He spends a lot more time on same-sex marriage because it's harder for us to understand if it's not a life and death matter, how morals have to come into the picture, especially if we're classical liberals who believe in individual liberty above all else. So if you're thinking about things like abortion and stem cell research, those are obvious, where it's harder to take out the morals for those issues because they're life and death. But same-sex marriage isn't life and death. And we're going to take a look at how Sandel thinks that you still shouldn't take morals out of the equation. He uses a case study from the Massachusetts Supreme Court, where they struck down a law. I think they were the first to institute same-sex marriage. Don't quote me on that. Regardless, the classically liberal view is that everybody should be able to do as they please without discrimination from the government. And contemporary Democrats, now remember, contemporary Democrats and Republicans both still have this underlying classical liberalism, where they both believe in individual liberty. But in this specific instance, Democrats are the ones that make the classically liberal argument that the government shouldn't discriminate and everybody should be able to do as they choose. So Republicans are moving away from classically liberal territory here when they counter by saying that when the government allows same-sex marriage, they're moving past the acceptance of pluralism. So remember, that's what classical liberals do. They accept the fact that there can be reasonable moral disagreements. And when the government accepts it, they're moving into the approval of the practice. They're saying they're not just letting it happen for freedom, they're saying that it's an okay thing to do morally as well. And that violates some conservatives' moral norms. So Sandel argues that Democrats, contemporary Democrats, still have implicit morality when they claim personal freedom. And he tries to illustrate this argument by showing three options open to governments about the issue. They can do one of three things. And this is on page 254. They can recognize only marriages between a man and a woman. They could recognize same-sex and opposite-sex marriages. Or, the lesser-known option, they cannot recognize marriage of any kind, but leave this role open to private associations. So this is the civil union argument. Governments would still have civil unions, and that could be open to all, non-discriminatory. So you'd get things like health benefits and inheritance, and being able to visit people in the hospital. But marriage, different somehow, would be left up to people. And this is very, very libertarian, very, very classically liberal. So if marriage has a moral role for you, you can do it in the church or however you so please. So governments could do any of these three. And I have up here, libertarians often back up option number 3. So government stays out of all moral issues. All this debate points to the fact that we think civil unions are different to marriage. But how? Why is it such an important issue for people? Sandel, because it says it's because we have a system of values that's already attached to what marriage is supposed to be for. It isn't morally neutral, and it can't be. We think it stands for something. Marriage ought to happen in a case where whatever values it is we think are attached to it are present. So conservatives say that the values of marriage should be about procreation. Not all of them, of course, some of them. But the Supreme Court of Massachusetts in the case study and lots of other court systems have struck that down. Nothing in our current laws mandate that a couple must have children in order to marry. So some people might have that value attached to marriage, but it's not a social norm. So Sandel paraphrases Justice Marshall from her decision, her written decision about same-sex marriage, where she says that the most common value or the group community value about marriage is that it's an exclusive and loving commitment between two partners, and it's not about having kids. So the value system that society already attaches to marriage is this, or something like it. Now, of course, judges nearly always rely on precedent to decide their cases, but what about regular people in everyday situations? Should we always rely on past definitions to decide how to shape our lives and communities? Sandel says no, and that even Judge Marshall moves past precedent and affirms gay marriage by using moral language, saying that it's something worthy and respect in and of itself. So then even in non-life or death issues, we need a public discourse on values. Because if they're present there, if they're already attached to our social institutions, ignoring them isn't going to make them go away. We need to debate and talk about what sort of values count as part of the life we want to shape for ourselves and our communities. Okay, so in the last two sections, he puts forward his positive argument about where we might want to go. If we want to be these communitarians, if we want to figure out what community values are and how we should work toward them, what should we do? So on page 261, he says, a just society cannot be achieved by simply maximizing utility or securing freedom of choice. To achieve a just society, we need to reason together about the meaning of a good life. It doesn't mean anyone should win out or there won't be conflicts, but we need to reason together about them and create a public culture hospitable to the disagreements that will inevitably arise. So he has another long quote, this time from Robert F. Kennedy, and I'm going to read that for you. It's on page 262. It starts on page 262. Our gross national product is now over $800 billion a year, but that gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwood and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. It counts napalm and counts nuclear warheads and armored cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities. It counts the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet the gross national product doesn't allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It doesn't include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell us everything about America except why we are proud to be Americans. So when we wash out meaning, when we wash out values, we wash out meaning too. We're left with the bare, gross national product. If we want measures of how life really is rich or meaningful or rewarding, we can't look to something that's absent value. And then he gives 4 little sections, suggestions or guidelines about how we can best start to have a discussion on more community-based ideals of justice. They're titled Citizenship, Sacrifice, and Service, The Moral Limits of Markets, Inequality, Solidarity, and Civic Virtue, and A Politics of Moral Engagement. So the first one, citizenship, sacrifice, service. Okay, so if a just society requires this community, how do we cultivate a community feeling in citizens, a concern for the whole? We can't be indifferent to one another. We have to bring out citizens to interact and engage in public life. Public school does this. The military might do this. Other kinds of service might do this. And of course, everybody's worried about the state of the public schools. So if we were going to commit to improving community feeling and virtue, we'd need to start with our infrastructure, not just education, not just service in the military. Obama, he mentions, started AmeriCorps, a push for service, citizenship, and individual sacrifice in the name of the whole. Second, are the moral limits of markets. This goes right back to that quote by RFK. When we absent virtue from all of our discourse, all that's left in a lot of people's minds are economic issues and considerations. Sandel lists lots of stuff that we didn't even talk about in his book, but also examples that he used. outsourcing pregnancy as paid labor, interrogation of prisoners to mercenaries or private contractors. But the new ones are we can offer cash payments to teachers for having their students score well on standardized tests. Or maybe the students get paid to study harder. For-profit prisons. And immigration policy being paid for. If you pay for citizenship, you get to be a citizen. So all these questions can't be answered, says Sandel, by just utility and consent. They're also about the right ways of valuing key social practices. And that's a direct quote from 265. So how do we value things like teaching, learning, criminal punishment, childbearing, the admission of new citizens, medical issues, and insurance issues? Again, it doesn't seem like market values, which are growth and wealth gathering, can really handle those. The third section, inequality, solidarity, and civic virtue. So Sandel talks about the wealth gap and how it can't be solved by utility alone. And its import isn't just about utility either. If there's too big of a gap between the rich and the poor, there's no community solidarity. And Sandel says that is required for democratic citizenship. So in a value-free economic society, the rich live in gated communities, and public education suffers, public transportation suffers, public spaces like parks and museums suffer because the rich stay in their own zone and they have all the goods and services they need, and the public's infrastructure suffers. Beyond that, the rich even stop patronizing or participating in public or civic life. And it just gets worse and worse and worse. So to fix this, well, first, he says this has two bad effects, both fiscal, so financially, and also bad civic effects. So the one I mentioned before with everything in the public deteriorating, yeah, those are the bad physical effects. And the fiscal effects are if the rich no longer participate in this civic life, then they don't support it with their taxes. The solidarity dissolves. Every individual person is cloistered in their own lives. And a lot of people, even apart from justice issues, worry about our community life deteriorating. The last one, the politics of moral engagement. So this is the wrap up to the whole book. I'll read a quote. Some consider public engagement with questions of the good life to be a civic transgression, a journey beyond the bounds of liberal public reason. Politics and law should not become entangled in moral and religious disputes, we often think, for such entanglement opens the way to coercion and intolerance, which is a legitimate worry. Citizens of pluralist societies do disagree about morality and religion. Even if it's not possible for the government to be neutral on these disagreements, is it nonetheless possible to conduct our politics on the basis of mutual respect? And the answer, he thinks, is yes, but we need, for that to happen, a more robust and engaged civic life with community values, where we care about one another, we sacrifice for one another, and we put service at the top. We create a community space where everybody maintains and uses the goods and services in civic life. And he thinks that that's a more positive ideal, more inspiring than just avoiding these moral issues altogether. And that community, and that even the disagreement about what morals and the good life should be, makes a stronger basis for mutual respect, not a weaker one, because we're interacting with one another all the time. He knows that some people might mistake this for a pipe dream or an ideal, but he wants you to remember that just because things are the way they are doesn't mean that that's the way they should be, and that's the heart of moral life. Okay, so in closing, I'd like you to think about counters to what Sandel's talking about. Also, the examples he uses to illustrate the fact that we should have moral or value discussion in our public life. Think about the ones from this chapter: same-sex marriage, abortion, stem cell research. Think about all the examples he's used all throughout the text. Should we give Purple Hearts to PTSD sufferers? Should we worry about price gouging after hurricanes? How should we recruit for the military? Should we force people into service? What would it be like, really, if we tried to create this community solidarity? So that's the end. Thank you for listening, and let me know, as always, if you have questions.